The impossible request. The bar was dimly lit, the kind of place where secrets came to hide. It floated at the edge of the galaxy, on a tiny asteroid no one cared to name. Beings from 100 worlds sat around, sipping drinks and murmuring in hushed tones. Elias walked in, his boots clicking against the metal floor. He was human, but different, calm, deliberate, and with an air that made others step aside. His short black hair and piercing eyes scanned the room before he headed for the bar. The bartender, Lyra, stood behind the counter. She was human too, with sharp features and a gaze that seemed to pierce through lies. Her long, dark hair was tied back, and her hands moved deftly as she cleaned a glass. She'd seen all kinds of people come through her bar, but something about Elias made her pause. Elias sat down and waited. He didn't order right away. He just let the silence settle, as if testing the air. Finally, he spoke. "I'll take an Inferno's touch," he said, his voice steady. The bar fell silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A reptilian alien at the next table choked on its drink. Even the air seemed to grow heavy. Lyra froze, the glass still in her hand. Slowly, she placed it on the counter. Her eyes narrowed as she leaned forward. "You're joking," she said, her voice low. "I'm not," Elias replied. Lyra studied him for a long moment. The room seemed to hold its breath. Everyone knew about the Inferno's touch. It wasn't just a drink, it was a legend. Rumor said it wasn't even supposed to exist. It was a liquid so potent, so dangerous, that it was banned across the galaxy. Only fools or the desperate ever asked for it. "Do you even know what you're asking for?" Lyra asked. "I do," Elias said. His tone was calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. Lyra shook her head. "I've had people come in here asking for things they shouldn't. But this," she hesitated, "this is different. You don't look stupid enough to want it just for fun." Elias leaned forward. "I need it," he said simply. Around them, the bar erupted into whispers. "He'll die," one alien muttered. "No one survives that drink," said another. "Is he insane?" Lyra raised a hand, and the room fell quiet again. Her gaze didn't leave Elias. "If you're serious about this, it's not just your life at risk," she warned. "This drink isn't just illegal. It draws attention. The kind you don't want." "I'm ready," Elias said. Lyra's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "All right," she said, stepping back. "But don't say I didn't warn you." From beneath the counter, she pulled out a small, locked case. The room collectively leaned forward, curiosity and fear mingling in their expressions. Lyra opened the case carefully, revealing a vial of liquid that seemed alive. It glowed a deep, fiery red, like molten lava, and tiny sparks danced across its surface. "Inferno's touch," Lyra said softly, almost reverently. "The drink of legends. They say it's not just a beverage, it's a test, a challenge to the universe itself." She poured a single drop into a glass. The liquid hissed and bubbled, releasing a faint trail of smoke. The smell was sharp and electric, like lightning in a bottle. Elias didn't flinch. He took the glass in his hand and held it up to the light. The glow reflected in his eyes. For a moment, it looked as if the fire was already inside him. "Last chance to back out," Lyra said. Elias shook his head. Not a chance. He brought the glass to his lips and drank. The reaction was immediate. The room seemed to shudder as an invisible force rippled through the air. The liquid burned its way down Elias's throat, but he didn't cough or gasp. Instead, his eyes widened, and for a brief second, they glowed the same fiery red as the drink. Around him, the patrons stared in awe and terror. The bar's lights flickered. Glasses shook on the tables. It was as if the entire universe had felt what just happened. Lyra stepped back, her eyes narrowing. "What are you?" she whispered. Elias set the glass down gently. "Human," he said. "Just human." Before anyone could say more, the bar's doors slammed open. A gust of cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of burnt metal. Everyone turned to look. Standing in the doorway was a towering alien, its body covered in dark, jagged armor. Its glowing yellow eyes scanned the room, and its deep voice rumbled like thunder. "Where is the one who drank the inferno?" it demanded. The room went silent again. All eyes turned to Elias. He didn't flinch. Slowly, he turned to face the alien, his expression calm. The faint glow in his eyes hadn't faded. "I guess that's me," Elias said. The alien took a step forward, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath its weight. "Then you are marked for death," it growled. Lyra's hand moved toward the blaster hidden under the counter, but Elias raised a hand, stopping her. "No need," he said. His voice was steady, but there was a new edge to it, a quiet, dangerous confidence. The alien snarled and lunged toward him. But before it could reach him, Elias's hand shot out, faster than anyone could follow. The air around him shimmered, and a sudden wave of heat surged through the room. The alien stopped, frozen in its tracks. Its armor glowed red-hot, and smoke rose from its body. Slowly, it backed away, its glowing eyes wide with fear. Elias stood, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Tell whoever sent you," he said, his voice low and firm, "that I'm not so easy to kill." The alien hesitated for a moment before turning and fleeing into the night. As the doors swung shut behind it, the bar erupted into chaos. Lyra stared at Elias, her expression unreadable. "What have you gotten yourself into?" she asked. Elias turned to her, the faint glow in his eyes fading. "Something I can't run from," he said, "but I'll need your help to finish it." Lyra frowned but nodded. "You've got it," she said. "But this is just the beginning. The price of the inferno." The smoke still lingered in the bar, the air thick with heat and tension. Elias stood in the middle of it all, calm and unshaken, like a storm that had passed but left destruction in its wake. Lyra, leaning against the counter, stared at him with a mix of disbelief and curiosity. "You just scared off a bounty hunter from the netherworlds," she said, her voice low but sharp. "Do you even realize what that means?" Elias picked up the glass he had emptied earlier, staring at the faint residue of the inferno's touch still glowing at the bottom. "It means they'll be back," he replied, his tone even. "They?" Lyra asked, raising an eyebrow. Elias didn't answer. Instead, he set the glass down and met her gaze. "There's more to this drink than you're telling me," he said. "Why did you have it? And why did you give it to me?" Lyra laughed dryly, though there was no humor in her voice. "You think I just serve this stuff for kicks?" She glanced around the bar, where patrons were cautiously returning to their seats, their whispers filled with fear and intrigue. "That drink isn't just illegal. It's a key." "A key to what?" Elias asked, his tone sharper now. Lyra hesitated. She looked around the room, then leaned in closer. "Not here," she whispered. "Too many ears. Follow me." Elias nodded, and together they slipped out through a back door, leaving behind the murmurs of the crowd and the faint glow of the bar. They walked through the winding alleys of the asteroid's outpost, where flickering neon signs lit the shadows. The place was alive with the sounds of machinery, distant chatter, and the occasional blare of alarms. But Lyra moved with purpose, and Elias followed silently. Finally, they stopped at a small, run-down docking bay. Lyra tapped a code into a hidden panel, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside was a small but well-equipped starship, its hull marked with scratches and burns from battles long past. "This is your ship?" Elias asked, stepping inside. Lyra smirked. "What, were you expecting a luxury cruiser?" She closed the door behind them and motioned for him to sit in the cockpit. Elias obliged, lowering himself into the co-pilot's chair. Lyra leaned against the console, her arms crossed. "All right," she began, her voice serious. "You want answers. Here's the truth. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small handheld device. With a tap, a hologram flickered to life, showing a map of the galaxy. Dozens of red dots glowed across the map, scattered like embers. "These," she said, pointing to the dots, "are human outposts, or what's left of them." Elias frowned. "What do you mean, what's left?" "Humanity," Lyra said, her tone bitter, "isn't what it used to be. 1,000 years ago, we were unstoppable. The strongest, smartest, most dangerous species in the galaxy. But then, something changed. We became the hunted." Elias leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Hunted by who?" Lyra's face hardened. "The Void Sovereign," she said. "An ancient power. No one knows where it came from, but it had one goal: to erase humanity. And it almost succeeded." Elias stared at the map, his mind racing. "And the Inferno's touch?" he asked. Lyra nodded. "Humanity knew it couldn't win through numbers or brute force. So we turned to something else: genetic engineering, advanced bioweapons, and drinks like the Inferno's touch. It's not just a drink, Elias. It's a catalyst. It unlocks something buried deep in our DNA, something the Void Sovereign feared." Elias glanced at his hands. Since he'd taken the drink, he'd felt different. Stronger. Sharper. The fire that had erupted from him in the bar wasn't just a fluke. It was something more. "So this drink," Elias said slowly, "it's part of some ancient human experiment." Lyra nodded. "A dangerous one. Most people who take it don't survive. Their bodies can't handle the power. But you're different. You didn't just survive, you thrived." Elias leaned back in the chair, processing her words. "And now I'm a target," he said. Lyra smirked. "You were a target the moment you walked into my bar and ordered that drink. The bounty hunter was just the beginning. The Void Sovereign's forces will come for you now. They can sense the energy the Inferno unlocked, and they won't stop until they have you, or until you're dead." Elias didn't flinch. Instead, he met her gaze, his expression calm. "Then we better be ready for them," he said. Lyra laughed softly, shaking her head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't be enough. If we're going to survive this, we'll need to move fast." She turned to the console and began tapping commands. The ship hummed to life, its engines glowing faintly. "Where are we going?" Elias asked. "To the last human outpost in this sector," Lyra replied. "There's someone there who might be able to help, but we'll have to get there before the Void Sovereign's fleet does." Elias nodded, his jaw set. "Let's go." As the ship lifted off, the stars outside the viewport blurred into streaks of light. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the faint hum of power still coursing through his veins. Whatever was coming, he knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. Escape into the unknown. The engines roared to life, and Lyra's ship shot out of the asteroid's docking bay like a comet. Behind them, alarms blared as the Void Sovereign's forces swarmed the outpost. In the co-pilot's seat, Elias strapped himself in, his gaze fixed on the viewport. The asteroid outpost was shrinking in the distance, but trouble was closing fast. 3 sleek, black ships with glowing red edges were gaining on them. "They're not letting us go," Elias muttered. Lyra didn't glance his way, her hands flying across the controls. "They never do," she replied. "Hold on to something." The ship veered sharply to the left, skimming the surface of a nearby asteroid field. Massive rocks tumbled through space, glowing faintly from the sun's distant light. Elias gripped the armrests of his seat. "You're taking us into an asteroid field. Isn't that a little suicidal?" Lyra smirked, her eyes focused on the chaos ahead. "Only if you don't know what you're doing. Lucky for you, I do." Behind them, the pursuing ships followed, their plasma cannons lighting up the darkness. Blasts of energy streaked past Lyra's ship, narrowly missing the engines. Elias unbuckled himself and stood, steadying himself against the ship's sudden lurches. "What are you doing?" Lyra snapped, glancing at him. "Buying us some time," Elias said. He headed toward the back of the ship, where a small weapons console was tucked into the wall. Lyra shook her head. "You have no idea how to use those guns." "Guess I'll learn fast," Elias called back. The ship jolted again as another blast grazed the hull. Sparks flew, and the lights flickered. Elias gritted his teeth as he reached the weapons console. The controls were alien, covered in symbols he didn't recognize. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing a button. A turret on the ship's underside sprang to life, swiveling toward the pursuing ships. Elias grabbed the targeting joystick, guiding the turret as best as he could. "All right," he muttered to himself. "Let's see if this works." The turret fired, sending a stream of glowing projectiles into the darkness. One of the pursuing ships banked hard to avoid the shots, but another wasn't so lucky. The projectiles hit its wing, and it spun out of control before slamming into an asteroid. "Nice shot," Lyra shouted from the cockpit. "Beginner's luck," Elias replied, a small grin forming. The remaining two ships pressed their attack, weaving through the asteroid field with alarming precision. Plasma bolts rained down on Lyra's ship, forcing her to take even more evasive maneuvers. Elias struggled to keep the turret locked on the enemy ships. The controls were sluggish, and the ship's sudden movements didn't help. "Can't you fly straighter?" he yelled. "If I fly straight, we're dead," Lyra shot back. Just as one of the enemy ships lined up a clean shot, something strange happened. Elias felt a sudden surge of heat in his chest, the same fire he'd felt after drinking the Inferno's touch. His vision blurred, and for a moment, it was as if time slowed. The targeting screen in front of him sharpened, the symbols becoming clear. Without thinking, Elias moved the joystick with inhuman precision. The turret fired again, this time hitting the enemy ship dead center. It exploded in a brilliant flash, scattering debris through the asteroid field. Elias blinked, the strange sensation fading as quickly as it had come. "Two down," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through him. Lyra glanced at the rear monitor, her eyes wide. "How did you?" "Later," Elias interrupted. "We've still got one more." The final enemy ship broke off its pursuit, hanging back as if regrouping. Lyra frowned. "That's not good," she muttered. "What's it doing?" Elias asked. "It's calling reinforcements," Lyra replied. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before we're swarmed." Elias cursed under his breath. "What's the plan?" Lyra's hands moved rapidly across the controls. "There's an old jump gate nearby. If I can get us there, we can jump to the other side of the sector before they catch us." "And if you can't?" Elias asked. Lyra gave him a tight smile. "Then I hope you've got more tricks up your sleeve." The ship sped toward the jump gate, a massive ring of ancient technology floating silently in the void. Its surface was cracked and weathered, but faint energy still pulsed through its core. The final enemy ship closed the distance, its plasma cannons charging. Lyra pushed the engines to their limit, the ship trembling from the strain. "We're not going to make it," Elias said, his voice grim. Lyra didn't respond. Her focus was absolute. The enemy ship fired, and the plasma bolt streaked toward them. At the last second, Lyra banked hard, the blast narrowly missing the engines. The jump gate loomed closer. "Brace yourself," Lyra shouted. Elias gripped the console as the ship hurtled through the gate. The moment they crossed the threshold, a blinding light enveloped them, and the ship jolted violently. When the light faded, they were surrounded by silence. The stars outside the viewport were unfamiliar, and the enemy ship was nowhere in sight. Lyra exhaled deeply, slumping back in her seat. "We made it," she said, her voice filled with relief. Elias leaned against the wall, catching his breath. "You really know how to keep things interesting," he said with a small chuckle. Lyra turned to him, her expression serious. "This is just the beginning," she said. "The Void Sovereign's forces won't stop until they've hunted us down. And if you're going to survive, You need to figure out what's happening to you. Elias nodded, the faint glow returning to his eyes. Then we'd better get moving, he said, because I don't plan on running forever. The ship hummed softly as it disappeared into the vast unknown, leaving behind the danger. For now, the forgotten weapon. The silence in the ship was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the engines. Lyra sat in the cockpit, staring at the cracked monitor displaying the galaxy map. Her fingers drummed against the console, her usual sharpness dulled by an air of tension. Elias leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed. He was still getting used to the strange heat pulsing in his veins, a lingering side effect of the Inferno's touch. His hands flexed involuntarily, a faint glow sparking between his fingers before fading. "What's wrong?" he asked, breaking the silence. Lyra sighed and glanced at him over her shoulder. "The coordinates for the human outpost. They're not responding. If we can't confirm their location, we're flying blind." Elias frowned. "You said they were our best chance." "They are," Lyra replied, "if they're still there." Her words hung in the air like a threat. Elias pushed off the doorway and walked to the cockpit, standing beside her. He looked at the map. A cluster of red markers surrounded their current position, void sovereign forces closing in. The human outpost, marked in faint blue, flickered uncertainly in the distance. "We don't have time to second-guess," Elias said. "If there's even a chance someone's still alive there, we go." Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but don't say I didn't warn you." She punched in the coordinates, and the ship lurched forward, the stars outside stretching into streaks as they jumped into hyperspace. The outpost came into view an hour later, nestled on the surface of a barren moon. It wasn't much, just a collection of crumbling buildings and a shield generator flickering weakly. The sight of it made Lyra's stomach twist. "This is it?" Elias asked, squinting at the screen. "Don't judge a book by its cover," Lyra replied. "There's more here than meets the eye." The ship landed with a hiss of decompressing air. As the ramp lowered, Elias was hit by the stale metallic scent of the moon's atmosphere. The outpost was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that hinted at something gone terribly wrong. "Stay close," Lyra said, pulling a compact blaster from her belt. Elias followed her down the ramp, his senses on high alert. The faint heat in his chest flared slightly, as if warning him of unseen danger. They entered the largest building, a hollowed-out structure with walls lined by broken screens and scattered debris. In the center of the room stood a lone figure, their back turned to the entrance. "Lyra," the figure said without turning around. Their voice was rough, tired. "Commander Myra," Lyra replied, lowering her weapon slightly. The figure turned, a woman, older than Lyra, with sharp eyes and a face etched with scars. She carried herself with the weight of someone who had seen too much. "You're late," Myra said, her gaze shifting to Elias. "And you brought company." "This is Elias," Lyra said. "He's special." Myra studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Special, huh?" she said finally. "You don't look like much." Elias raised an eyebrow. "And you look like someone who's lost more battles than they've won." Lyra winced, but Myra chuckled, a low, bitter sound. "Fair enough," she said. "Let's see if you're as useful as Lyra seems to think." Myra led them deeper into the outpost, past rusted doors and flickering lights. They stopped in a small chamber filled with ancient human technology, data terminals, holographic projectors, and a glowing pedestal in the center of the room. "This is why we're here," Myra said, gesturing to the pedestal. Elias stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. On the pedestal sat a sphere, its surface covered in faintly glowing lines that pulsed rhythmically. "What is it?" he asked. "The core of humanity's last great weapon," Myra said. "Before the Void Sovereign destroyed our armies, we created something that could turn the tide of war. But we were betrayed before it could be activated." Elias reached out to touch the sphere, but Myra grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't," she warned. "This isn't a toy. The weapon requires a human to activate it, a human with the genetic potential to withstand its power. Most don't survive the process." Elias pulled his hand back, glancing at Lyra. "And you think I can?" Lyra nodded. "You drank the Inferno's touch and lived. That means your DNA is already different. If anyone can activate this, it's you." Myra stepped back, her arms crossed. "But be warned," she said. "Once you touch that core, there's no going back. The Void Sovereign will know where you are, and they'll throw everything they have at us." Elias stared at the sphere, the faint heat in his chest growing stronger. He could feel it calling to him, as if it were alive. "I didn't come this far to back down," he said finally. "Let's do this." Lyra and Myra exchanged a glance, then nodded. Elias reached out and placed his hand on the sphere. The moment his fingers touched its surface, the room was bathed in blinding light. Elias gasped as a surge of energy tore through him, his body trembling under the strain. His mind was flooded with images, memories of humanity's past, their victories, their defeats, and the weapon's true purpose. When the light faded, Elias stood taller, his eyes glowing with a fierce red hue. The sphere's lines had stopped pulsing, now glowing steadily. "What did you see?" Lyra asked, her voice hushed. Elias turned to her, his expression grim. "I saw the Void Sovereign's fleet," he said. "They're already on their way." Outside, the faint rumble of approaching ships shook the ground. Myra grabbed her weapon, her face set in determination. "Then we make our stand here," she said. "The fate of humanity depends on it." Elias clenched his fists, the heat in his chest now a raging fire. "Good," he said. "Let them come. The battle awakens." The moon trembled beneath their feet as the Void Sovereign's fleet descended. Elias stood at the outpost's entrance, staring into the dark horizon. Faint flashes of red streaked the sky, marking the arrival of enemy ships. His body thrummed with energy, the power from the weapon core still coursing through him. Behind him, Lyra and Myra worked feverishly. The outpost's defensive systems, long dormant, groaned to life as sparks flew from consoles and alarms blared. "Shields at 30%. Lyra shouted. "That's all we're getting without a miracle." "We'll have to make it work," Myra replied, her voice calm despite the chaos. She turned to Elias, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You better be ready. They're not sending scouts. They're sending an army." Elias smirked, rolling his shoulders as faint sparks of red light flickered around his fists. "Let them. I've been itching to see what this new power can do." The first wave hit hard. The Void Sovereign soldiers, towering, insectoid creatures with razor-sharp claws and glowing eyes, poured from dropships that landed just outside the outpost. Their war cries echoed through the barren landscape as they charged forward. Elias didn't wait. He leaped into the fray, moving faster than seemed possible. The first creature swung at him, its claws slicing through the air, but Elias ducked and countered with a punch that sent it flying. The ground beneath him cracked as his enhanced strength came to life. He spun, dodging another attacker and landing a kick that shattered its exoskeleton. From the outpost, Lyra watched, her jaw tightening. "He's holding them off," she murmured, disbelief mingling with awe. "For now," Myra said grimly. She tapped a button on her console, activating a row of automated turrets outside. The turrets whirred to life, firing streams of plasma into the advancing enemy lines. Elias fought like a force of nature, his movements fluid and unrelenting. Each strike ignited small bursts of fire, a side effect of the energy flowing through him. But no matter how many enemies he felled, more kept coming. Inside the outpost, Lyra worked frantically to stabilize the shields. "If we don't hold them back, this place will be overrun in minutes," she said, sweat beading on her brow. Myra gritted her teeth. "We need more time. The weapon core, it's not fully integrated yet. If we can't sync it to our systems, we're finished." Then stop talking and start sensing. Lyra snapped. Outside, Elias was starting to falter. The energy within him burned hotter, but it was beginning to feel like a double-edged sword. Each movement felt heavier, each strike costing him more strength. As another wave of enemies closed in, Elias slammed his fists into the ground. A shockwave of fire erupted from him, engulfing the nearest attackers and forcing the rest to fall back. He staggered, breathing heavily. "This power," he muttered, clutching his chest. "It's too much." A deep rumble echoed through the air. Elias looked up to see a massive void sovereign warship descending, its shadow blotting out the faint light from the distant sun. From the warship, a new figure emerged, a massive, armored being that radiated an aura of command. Its voice boomed, amplified by unseen technology. "Human," it said, its tone cold and mocking. "You dare wield the ancient power of your kind. Surrender now, and I may grant you a quick death." Elias straightened, his breathing still labored. He glanced back at the outpost, where Lyra and Myra were still working desperately. "No surrender," he said, his voice steady despite the strain. The armored figure laughed, a hollow metallic sound. "Then you will die like the rest of your pitiful species." It raised a massive weapon, a glowing halberd crackling with dark energy, and charged. Elias met the charge head-on. Their clash sent shockwaves rippling through the air, shaking the ground beneath them. The Void Sovereign commander was faster and stronger than the others, each swing of its weapon aimed with deadly precision. Elias dodged and countered as best as he could, but the strain of the battle was wearing on him. The fire in his chest flared wildly, threatening to consume him. Inside the outpost, Lyra's console beeped. "Got it," she shouted. "The weapon core is online." Myra didn't hesitate. She activated the outpost's main system, and a deep hum resonated through the walls. Outside, the faint glow of the outpost's shield intensified, creating a barrier that pushed back the advancing enemy forces. Elias felt the surge of energy from the outpost and used it as a burst of adrenaline. He sidestepped the commander's next swing and landed a punch that cracked its armor. The commander stumbled but recovered quickly. It roared in fury, raising its halberd for a final strike. "Elias," Lyra's voice crackled through his communicator. "Get clear. We're about to overload the core." Elias gritted his teeth. "Not yet," he replied. He grabbed the halberd mid-swing, the fire in his veins surging to its peak. The energy exploded outward, engulfing both him and the commander in a blinding light. When the light faded, the battlefield was eerily quiet. The Void Sovereign forces had retreated, their warship pulling back into orbit. Elias stood in the center of the devastation, his body smoking but intact. His eyes still glowed faintly, but the fire within him had cooled to a steady pulse. Lyra and Myra ran out of the outpost, skidding to a stop as they reached him. "Are you alive, or are we talking to a ghost?" Lyra asked, half joking. Elias managed a faint smile. "Still here," he said. Myra looked at the retreating warship. "They'll be back," she said. Elias nodded. "Let them come," he replied. "This isn't over, not by a long shot." The outpost hummed softly, the weapon core glowing brighter than ever. For the first time in decades, humanity had a fighting chance. The Void Sovereign. The Void Sovereign's flagship loomed in the distance like a dark star, its jagged edges glinting against the cold void. From the outpost's battered command center, Elias stared at the live feed on the flickering monitor. The ship was massive, dwarfing everything around it. A clear message that no one could stand against its might. "Tell me that's not where we're headed," Lyra said, leaning against the console. Elias didn't answer. His glowing eyes were locked on the screen, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "Elias," Myra said, stepping forward, "you don't have to do this. The weapon core is powerful, but it's not complete. If you face the Void Sovereign now—" "They won't stop," Elias interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Not until every last human is dead. You said it yourself. We can't keep running." Lyra shook her head. "This isn't just running. This is suicide." Elias turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "Then I'll make my death count." An hour later, Elias stood in the outpost's docking bay, his back to Lyra and Myra. The faint hum of Lyra's ship filled the air as it prepared for launch. "You don't have to come," Elias said without turning around. Lyra snorted. "And let you steal all the glory? Not a chance." Myra approached, a small device in her hand. "This is the key," she said, pressing it into Elias's palm. "It will fully activate the weapon core, but only once. After that," she hesitated. "After that, it burns out," Elias finished, nodding. "Got it." Myra placed a hand on his shoulder. "Just come back," she said. Elias didn't reply. He simply stepped onto the ship, the ramp closing behind him. The journey to the Void Sovereign's flagship was tense. Lyra piloted the ship in silence, her usual sharp remarks replaced by a quiet determination. Elias sat in the co-pilot's seat, his mind racing. He could feel the power within him growing stronger, the weapon core responding to his resolve. But with each surge of energy came a growing sense of unease. "It's not just a weapon," he murmured. Lyra glanced at him. "What?" "The core," Elias said. "It's alive. I can feel it. Whispering." Lyra frowned. "Whispering what?" Elias shook his head. "I don't know, but it feels like it's waiting for something." They docked in the shadows of the Void Sovereign's flagship, using Lyra's ship's cloaking device to avoid detection. The interior of the flagship was as imposing as its exterior, dark, vast, and eerily quiet. Elias led the way, his glowing eyes cutting through the dim corridors. Lyra followed close behind, her blaster drawn. "You'd think they'd have more guards," she muttered. "They don't need guards," Elias said. "This ship is a trap." As if on cue, the lights flickered, and a deep, resonant voice filled the air. "Welcome, human," the Void Sovereign said. Its tone was smooth and mocking, with an edge of malice. "I've been expecting you." The corridor ahead of them shifted, the walls folding and rearranging until they formed a massive chamber. At its center stood the Void Sovereign, a towering, amorphous figure of shadow and light. Its presence was overwhelming, the very air seeming to ripple around it. "So this is what remains of humanity's defiance," the Void Sovereign said, its many eyes fixing on Elias. "A single man, clutching at a forgotten power he barely understands." Elias stepped forward, his fists glowing brighter. "You should have finished the job when you had the chance." The Void Sovereign chuckled, a sound that sent shivers through the air. "And missed the opportunity to see you destroy yourself." "No, I think not. Come, human. Show me what your kind is truly capable of." The battle was unlike anything Elias had faced before. The Void Sovereign moved with impossible speed, its form shifting and twisting as it lashed out with tendrils of energy. Elias fought back, the fire within him roaring to life. Each strike sent shockwaves through the chamber, the energy of the weapon core amplifying his every move. But the Void Sovereign was relentless, its attacks growing stronger with each passing moment. "You cannot win," it taunted. "The power you wield is a fragment of what I once controlled. You are nothing but a shadow of your former glory." Elias gritted his teeth, pushing himself harder. The whispers from the weapon core grew louder, drowning out the Void Sovereign's voice. "Activate me," the core seemed to say. "End this." Outside the chamber, Lyra watched from a distance, her heart pounding. She could see the strain in Elias's movements, the fire in his chest beginning to flicker. "He's not going to make it," she muttered. Her hand hovered over her communicator, ready to call out to him. But before she could, the chamber shook violently, and a blinding light erupted from within. Elias stood at the center of the chaos, his body glowing with an intensity that matched the Void Sovereign's dark energy. The key in his hand pulsed, the final piece of the weapon core's power waiting to be unleashed. The Void Sovereign loomed over him, its form crackling with anticipation. "Do it," it said, its voice dripping with mockery. "Unleash your power. Destroy us both. Show the galaxy what it truly means to be human." Elias hesitated, the key trembling in his grip. The whispers from the core were deafening now, 1,000 voices urging him to act. "I'm not just doing this for humanity," he said, his voice steady. "I'm doing this for everyone you've terrorized." With a final surge of resolve, Elias activated the key. The chamber was consumed by light and fire as the weapon core released its full power. The Void Sovereign let out a deafening roar, its form disintegrating in the face of the unleashed energy. Elias stood firm, his body glowing brighter than ever. As the light engulfed him, he whispered, "This is for all of us." The screen went white, the sound of the explosion echoing across the stars. The aftermath would change the galaxy forever. But for now, silence reigned, and the fate of Elias remained a mystery. The spark of hope. The silence after the explosion was deafening. The Void Sovereign's flagship was gone, reduced to a drifting graveyard of debris. The outpost's sensors struggled to make sense of the chaos, flashing warnings of radiation, heat surges, and energy distortions unlike anything recorded before. Lyra's hands trembled as she worked the ship's controls, her voice shaking. "Elias, come on, answer me." She stared at the communicator, but no response came, only static. Outside the viewport, the battlefield was eerily calm. The fleet that had surrounded the outpost was retreating, their leader destroyed. Yet victory felt hollow. Behind her, Myra stood frozen, her scared face unreadable. "He knew this would happen," she said quietly. "He made his choice." Lyra slammed her fist on the console. "No, he's alive. He has to be." The ship's scanners pinged, and Lyra's heart leaped. A faint signal flickered among the debris field. Chaotic, but unmistakably human. Without hesitation, she activated the engines and piloted the ship toward the source. As they approached, the light of a red flare cut through the darkness, and Lyra's breath caught in her throat. Floating amidst the wreckage was Elias. His body was battered, his clothes scorched, but his eyes were open, glowing faintly with the same fire that had destroyed the Void Sovereign. "Get him on board," Lyra shouted. Myra moved quickly, activating the ship's tractor beam. Moments later, Elias was lying in the cargo bay, barely conscious. Lyra knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "You stubborn idiot," she said, her voice breaking. "You actually did it." Elias coughed weakly, managing a faint smile. "Told you, I wasn't done yet." Hours later, as Elias recovered in the medbay, Lyra and Myra worked to make sense of the situation. The weapon core, now silent, sat in a containment chamber. Its once bright glow had faded to a dim flicker, like the last ember of a dying fire. "What happens now?" Lyra asked, her arms crossed. Myra glanced at the monitors, which displayed the retreating fleet. "The Void Sovereign is gone, but its forces aren't. They'll regroup. They always do." But without their leader, Lyra began, her voice trailing off. "They'll be weaker," Myra said, "but not defeated. Not yet." Elias joined them in the command center, still pale but standing tall. The faint glow in his eyes had dimmed, but the fire within him remained. "They're running," he said, looking at the monitors. "We need to make sure they never come back." Myra shook her head. "You don't understand. This isn't over. The Void Sovereign was just a piece of something bigger. Its destruction will draw attention. Other powers will come, curious about what happened here." "Let them come," Elias said firmly. "Humanity isn't hiding anymore." The outpost's survivors, inspired by Elias's actions, rallied together. Word of the Void Sovereign's defeat spread quickly across the galaxy, carried by whispers and intercepted transmissions. For the first time in centuries, Humanity was seen not as prey, but as a force to be reckoned with. Lyra watched as Elias stood before a gathering of humans and alien allies, his presence commanding despite his injuries. "We've lived in fear for too long," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "We've been hunted, scattered, and forgotten. But today we proved that humanity isn't finished. We don't just survive, we fight. And we win." The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound echoing through the outpost. Later, as the outpost prepared for its next steps, Lyra approached Elias. "So, what's the plan, hero?" she asked, her tone teasing but her eyes serious. Elias smirked. "The plan? Simple. We find the rest of the Sovereign's forces and take them down, one by one. And we show the galaxy what humanity is really made of." Lyra chuckled, shaking her head. "You're insane." "Maybe," Elias said, "but it's the good kind of insane." As the outpost's lights dimmed and the stars outside shone brighter, Elias stood at the viewport, watching the horizon. The fire within him was quieter now, but it burned with purpose.